The book, Justice, What's the Right Thing to Do, that I've just written, in a way, is an attempt to do what the RSA does, which is to connect the world of philosophy and political theory and ideas with actual politics, public life, civic life, democratic life. And so it attempts to lay out some of the different ways that the great political philosophers of the past have thought about justice, but in a way that is accessible and inviting, or so I hope, not just to scholars and academics, but to informed, politically minded citizens who care about these questions. So what I would like to do is really just to give you a very brief summary of the three traditions that frame the book, the account, the story of justice, three different ways of thinking about justice, and then to take up maybe one or two contemporary moral or political controversies that raise philosophical questions, and then see what you think. So, of the three traditions, the first is probably the most familiar, especially in the UK, but generally in the Anglo-American world. It says that justice means seeking the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. This is the utilitarian idea, going back to Jeremy Bentham, revised in some respects by John Stuart Mill. It has fundamentally to do with the idea of adding up, weighing, calculating, adding up and satisfying people's preferences to maximize the balance of happiness over unhappiness, of pleasure over suffering. That's the first idea of justice. There's been much debate about that idea, influential though it is. It has some clear and familiar defects. One of them is that it doesn't seem to take seriously the rights of the individual, human dignity, certain categorical duties and rights. One can easily illustrate this by thinking of ancient Rome. They threw Christians to the lions in the Colosseum for sport. What would a utilitarian say about the justice of that practice? Well, on the one hand, the Christian suffers enormous pain while being devoured by the lion. But think about it. If there are enough, say tens of thousands, enough very happy, amused Romans in the Colosseum cheering this gruesome spectacle, it's not obvious that the utilitarian way of thinking about justice could condemn it. Now utilitarians have thought about this case, been confronted by it, and they have answers to it, having to do with the long run, usually. Well, maybe that day the thing to do to maximize utility would be to toss the Christian to the lions and please the crowd, the mob, the cheering multitude. But over time, if this became a widespread practice, people would be afraid that their turn would come next. There would be fear and trembling in the streets. But even if that's true, is that the only reason it's wrong to toss the Christian to the lion for sport? Probably not. Something morally seems objectionable. If the only reason to desist from that gruesome spectacle is that there might be a long-run calculus that other people would be worried. This leads to the second broad account of justice available in the tradition, which is the idea that justice isn't just about adding up pain and pleasure, costs and benefits, happiness and suffering. On the second view, justice is about respecting freedom, and in particular, the right of individuals to choose for themselves what ends to pursue and what lives to live. So call this the freedom idea of justice. It's a rival, in some ways, morally more demanding idea than the utilitarian theory of justice. And it, too, informs much contemporary debate on both sides of the Atlantic. The freedom school, the freedom-based theory of justice, actually has two different camps within it. There are those who think what it means to respect freedom is to let people choose for themselves what value to place on the goods they exchange in a free market. So free market libertarians represent one strand of the freedom-based conception of justice. Any attempt to redistribute income or wealth from where it falls in a free market, provided no one is coerced, provided nothing is stolen, is unjust for the libertarian. But there's another strand of the freedom school that doesn't believe that people really are free in the course of buying and selling goods in the market. Advocates of this second strand of the freedom conception of justice point out that sometimes market transactions may not be as voluntary as they seem. If there is severe inequality, for example, in a society, if some people have very few life opportunities, they may take jobs. Well, take the example of sweatshops. They may take a job in a sweatshop. Now, it may be, says the critic of market freedom, it may be that that person wasn't forced at gunpoint to take a job in a sweatshop, but neither were they really free in any meaningful sense. So according to the second strand of freedom, really to respect the rights of each person to live and pursue his or her own path requires fair background conditions, requires that there not be such grave inequalities that people at the bottom are coerced in effect by economic necessity. And so advocates of this second strand of the freedom-based theory of justice say a just society is one where people are free, meaningfully free, really free to choose their ends and values for themselves, which requires a certain safety net, a decent minimum of housing and income and food and education, equal opportunity, broadly speaking, rather than grave, devastating inequalities of circumstance. So the argument, many of the arguments we have in politics today are actually between these two different strands of the freedom-based school, between what we might call the libertarian, laissez-faire free market view and the liberal, egalitarian, social welfare state view of justice. And sometimes there are quarrels between utilitarians and those who favor strong individual rights. But there is a third tradition. The third tradition, and it's one that goes all the way back to Aristotle, says that a just society is not one simply that maximizes utility, or even one that respects free individual choice, consenting adults. A just society is one that concerns itself with the preferences we bring to public life in the first place. A just society has to worry about shaping citizens, cultivating citizenship, nurturing civic virtue, so that citizens aren't just out for themselves, don't just see public life as a marketplace by other means, but instead see public life, democratic life, as a shared project, as a common venture oriented to a common good that might be more than just the sum of individual interests and preferences. On this third conception of justice, to live in a just society is to live in a society that concerns itself with the civic education of citizens so that they care about the common good, not just their own individual interests. Now, this may sound appealing on the face of it. It's a more demanding idea of democratic citizenship than the first two. More demanding because it doesn't simply accept people's preferences as they come, but regards those preferences as open to critical examination and possibly improvement. So it's appealing in that way. It aims higher, at a higher civic ideal than taking people's preferences as given by markets or by consumerism or by self-interest. But it's also dangerous and risky in the following sense. If public life, if democratic life, if, for that matter, justice requires that we collectively concern ourselves with the habits and dispositions of citizens, with the qualities of character that our fellow citizens bring to public life, doesn't that risk, here's the worry, here's the objection, doesn't that kind of politics, for all its idealism, risk being judgmental and even possibly intolerant and coercive? That's the worry. Now, the appeal of utilitarian and freedom-based theories is that they seem to say that government and politics and law should be neutral on what it is to have good character, should be neutral on the question of virtue and the good life. People, after all, in pluralist societies disagree about what the good life consists in. They disagree on big moral and spiritual questions. So the appeal of the freedom-based conception, and also the utilitarian one, is that they seem to promise a kind of moral neutrality that spares our politics the conflict and the contest over what the good life looks like, what good character consists in, over what habits and dispositions we should try to cultivate in democratic citizens. But it seems to me, and this is the part where, I won't say I'll get into trouble, where we'll provoke a discussion. It seems to me that this third tradition, though it harkens all the way back to Aristotle's idea of politics, though it's less familiar than the utilitarian and freedom-based traditions in our politics today, this third tradition way of thinking about justice has a point. And you can see this if you look at the actual political debates we have about justice. Whether we're arguing about bailouts for the big banks in the wake of the financial crisis, or healthcare reform, as we now are struggling with in the United States, or the distribution of income and wealth, and what counts as a fair system of taxation, or fiercely contested cultural issues that find their way onto the political agenda, like same-sex marriage, or affirmative action. What's a fair way of admitting students to colleges and universities, or of hiring workers? On all of these questions, though we tell ourselves that we argue about them mainly from the standpoint of utility, the general welfare on the one hand, and freedom or respect for individual rights on the other, just beneath the surface of the positions we take on those questions, just beneath the surface of the arguments we have, are conceptions about who deserves what, about what virtues are worthy of honor and recognition, about what conceptions of the good should be recognized and embodied in law. Now, Let me offer a couple of illustrations about this and then see what you think. Take the outrage over the bailouts, an outrage that was felt on both sides of the Atlantic. The political establishment, the Treasury officials came to the publics in both of our countries and said, we have to bail out the banks. And these huge, systemically strategic investment houses. And people said, but that isn't fair. How can it be fair to take taxpayer money and give it to wealthy banks and CEOs? And then came the bonuses after that. They're the ones who engaged in the risky behavior. They're the ones who profited when times were good. They privatized the gains, and now you're asking us to socialize the losses. How can that be fair? And what was the answer? The answer was, we have to do it. We have to do it or the whole system might melt down and collapse, and that would hurt everybody. So swallow for the moment your worries about fairness and distributive justice. We just have to do it. As some commentators put it, fairness is off the table now. We have to salvage the system. What was behind the outrage? One of the interesting things is that the outrage hasn't really gone away. Even though people swallowed it for the moment, they didn't have much choice, and carried on with the bailout. I think there is still, in our politics, a lurking anger and resentment. Outrage is an interesting emotion, morally and politically. It's anger, but not any kind of anger. Outrage is anger at injustice. What exactly was the injustice here? Partly it was a matter of fairness in distribution. Those receiving the bailouts and the bonuses tended to be wealthy, and the taxpayers who were supporting those bailouts, on the whole, were less wealthy. So partly there was a distributional worry, but it wasn't only that. I think deep down, there was a moral intuition that it's unjust because the people receiving the bailouts and the bonuses don't deserve them. They don't deserve them. Why? Well, one explanation is they're greedy. They were greedy. They made reckless gambles. They got us into this mess. Greed is a vice. It's not something that should be honored and rewarded. That idea, the idea of greed, lay behind some of the outrage. I was in an airport just at the time that the bonus furor began. You remember AIG started handing out bonuses to people in the very division that had created the mess, the derivatives, financial derivatives division. And I saw one of the tabloids in New York Post, with a full-page headline that captured this idea, this Aristotelian idea of moral desert. Well, they didn't quite put it in those terms. It said, "Not so fast, you greedy bastards." But there was an Aristotelian idea buried in that headline, which is, they don't deserve it. If anything, they deserve punishment, not reward. There were congressional hearings where they called some of the heads of these investment houses and asked, they wanted at least a mea culpa. They wanted to understand why it was that this happened. How could you have let this happen? And some of them said something like the following: well, we were hit by a financial tsunami. There was really nothing we could do. We were victims of forces beyond our control. Now, the congressmen and women who were questioning them didn't think of the logical follow-up question. If when things went bad, you're telling us it was due to the weather, and therefore you're not morally responsible for the losses, what about back not long ago when you were reaping enormous gains and taking them home. Isn't it possible that big systemic forces beyond your control also had something to do with the rise of the stock market in the 80s and 90s? Isn't it possible that the globalization of finance and the advent of the internet and a host of other big systemic forces accounted in large measure, the run-up in the housing market? Was that all you're doing too? No? Well, does that mean you didn't deserve that great windfall back then? They didn't ask that follow-up. But it is a question that democratic citizens can ask as we examine the moral fallout and aftermath of the financial crisis. It isn't just a matter of new regulations to prevent a similar thing from happening again. If we take seriously the questions of justice that are raised but haven't yet been answered in the wake of the financial crisis, I think we could be in for a round, should be in for a round, of serious political argument about who deserves what and why by way of compensation. The average CEO of an large American company makes how much more, would you say? How many times what the average worker makes? What would be your guess? 30? It's 344 times. Now, from the standpoint of justice in compensation, would you say that that is deserved? Is that earned? Well, the standard argument is CEOs of big companies work very hard, they're very talented, and they contribute a lot to the success of the company. And that may or may not be true, as we've seen in recent years, but suppose it's true. In 1980, as recently as 1980, the ratio was not 344, it was 42. So, do we really think that CEOs in 2008 were 8 times as hardworking, 8 times as smart, 8 times as talented as CEOs in 1980? Not likely. All of which suggests is that the compensations, the rewards that markets dispense don't plausibly correspond to anything that we could reasonably say is moral desert, what people deserve. All sorts of contingencies beyond the control, beyond the doing of the executives themselves account for those wage differentials. And if that's true, then the idea that there's any particular moral sanctity to the dispensations of markets needs to be rethought. And we should consider markets really for what they are, which is effective instruments for organizing productive activity. But in recent years, we've slid into the assumption that they're about something more than that, that they somehow confer fairness or confer a moral entitlement on the distributions that result from them. That idea is a mistake, and we can see that it's a mistake if we reflect on the answers that these CEOs gave when things went bad. Now, how does this bear out the importance of this third way of thinking about justice? We've just been talking about who deserves what. Do huge compensations reward superior virtue, superior contribution? Or do they reflect accidents and contingencies of supply and demand and technology and all manner of other things that are no doing of the people who earn those rewards. That's one issue of desert. But it's been another feature of the last 3 decades, roughly, that markets have been seen not just to confer fairness on the outcomes they produce, but markets have also begun to reach into spheres of life traditionally governed by non-market values. By 2007 in Iraq, in the Iraq War, for the first time in recent memory, the number of paid private military contractors exceeded the number of US military troops. The same is true in Afghanistan. The outsourcing of war, the use of markets. Now, we never had it. It might or might not be a good thing. There's reason to worry about it, the outsourcing of war, but we never had a deliberate democratic debate about whether we wanted this, whether this was a good thing or not. In many spheres of life, markets have reached in to areas traditionally governed by non-market values. In health, in education, in security, the advent of for-profit schools, for-profit prisons, for-profit hospitals. The extension of markets into family life, into reproduction. The rise of commercial surrogacy, paid pregnancy, the outsourcing of pregnancy. Now, for a time, for some years, the practice of commercial surrogacy has been available. But increasingly now in a global age, it's been outsourced, much as the fighting of wars has been outsourced. In 2002, India legalized commercial surrogacy in the hopes of creating a new industry. And now there are cities in India that cater to the pregnancy trade. Couples from the US, from Britain, from Germany, from Taiwan could hire surrogates at home in some cases where it's legally permitted, but it's expensive, about $75,000 to $80,000. Now, with the globalization of the economy, there's been an outsourcing of paid pregnancy to low-wage countries. It's a third the cost in India of what it is here. And so there's a town in India, in Gujarat, that has dozens upon dozens of women carrying pregnancies for people in the West. This town is becoming to the surrogacy industry what Bangalore is becoming to call centers. Now, here's a question for policy. Is it objectionable or not? Is it something that we should worry about or not? Or does it simply realize the efficiencies of markets? People are freely choosing. No one is forcing them to carry paid pregnancies. So it meets the freedom criterion, unless you think they're coerced by being poor, in which case there could be some debate. But that aside, is there any objection? Certainly not on utilitarian grounds. Both parties are better off. It's worth it to them. Is there any good reason to have some lingering moral worry about it? Insofar as we do, what could be its basis? It could only be that we think that commodifying pregnancy and childbearing somehow fails to value the goods, the human goods associated with those practices in the wrong way. That it values them in the wrong way. But that's an argument about the nature of the good. Like most cases of contested commodification we encounter these days, should you pay children to read books to increase learning rates in inner city schools? If we want to ask the question and debate publicly the question, what are the moral limits of markets? It won't do simply to rest on utilitarian considerations, which will tell you about efficiency, or on freedom considerations, which will tell you whether the choice was really free, really voluntary. one has to look case by case, sphere by sphere of social life to determine whether market norms crowd out non-market norms, and if so, whether that represents a loss, a degradation, a corruption of something, of a good, or of a social practice, or of a norm worth prizing or cherishing or preserving. That's a normative question that goes directly to the question of the good, the nature of the good. So if, let me just now give the moral bottom line of if we want to have a public debate about the moral limits of markets, we can't avoid considerations from this third tradition about the nature of the good. In this case, the nature of the good of social practices. What norms do we want to protect from being crowded out or eroded or degraded by market norms, whether to do with the family or reproduction or childbearing or health or education or security? Organ sales would be another. Military service. We can't avoid the discourse of the good life, of civic virtue, and of the common good. So, part of what I'm suggesting is that we aren't aiming high enough in our public discourse insofar as we shrink from engaging with hard questions, big questions, about virtue, moral desert, and the good life. But I'm also suggesting that even if you don't want to aspire to a higher civic idealism, even if you think this is too demanding, even if you think that it consorts with the danger of intolerance and coercion, what happens if we disagree about the good? Who's to decide? Even if you think that, you still have to answer the hard question, can you provide a morally compelling answer to any of these political questions, policy questions, without implicitly taking a stand on what norms, what virtues, what conceptions of the good are worth honoring, rewarding, and encouraging? I think you can't. So what I'm really suggesting by trying to draw on this third tradition as a supplement to the other two is that justice isn't only about seeking the greatest good for the greatest number. It isn't only about securing freedom of choice. It isn't only about distributing things. It's also about the right way of valuing things. And if we're to have that debate, we need to have a debate that is more open and inviting to the full range of moral and I would say even spiritual conceptions and ideals that citizens care about and bring to public life. So while the book is called Justice, it really in the end is about democratic citizenship. Because a democratic life, a democratic public deliberation that tries to keep these big moral questions out of the public square doesn't really answer to what it means to be a citizen. So this is why I think that an engagement with some of the big questions of political philosophy and the third tradition, this older, slightly worrying tradition of justice, is an indispensable feature of reviving and invigorating and bringing about a more morally robust public life. Thanks very much.